My name is Jessica Rose, and I am 28 years old. If you had asked me a year ago whether I believed my father was capable of destroying my wedding with a paid actress, I probably would have laughed first and then said no. Not because he was easy, not because he was healthy, but because there are certain lines you tell yourself a parent would never cross, even when they've spent years proving they don't respect boundaries. Now I know better. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back to Ohio, to the kind of small town where everyone somehow knows your business before you do. The kind of place where divorces become public entertainment, where grocery store smiles are often just camouflage for gossip, and where a family can be quietly falling apart while neighbors still compliment the front lawn. My childhood looked normal from the outside until I was 10. That was the year everything split open. My mother, Tanya, had been having an affair with her yoga instructor for months. I didn't know that at first, of course. At 10, adults think you only notice what they explain, but children notice far more than people realize. The lowered voices behind closed doors, the way one parent starts sleeping on the couch, the brittle tone that turns even simple questions into arguments, the silence at dinner, the way your stomach tightens before you even understand why. When my father found out, it was like someone had detonated something in the middle of our house. There was no graceful collapse, no quiet separation, no careful attempt to shield me from the ugliness of it. The divorce was long, hostile, and humiliating, in that specific way only small-town divorces can be, where everyone has an opinion and no one has enough decency to keep it to themselves. My mother left for California with a suitcase, a cloud of guilt, and what I later understood was a desperate need to outrun the life she had wrecked. I stayed in Ohio with my father, Patrick, not because I chose him in some dramatic moment of loyalty, but because he was the stable option on paper. He had the steady career, the house, the routine. My mother had regret and reinvention. My father had structure. At first, I told myself I was lucky to still have one reliable parent. The problem was that my father did not stay the same man after the divorce. Before everything happened, he had been warm in a simple, ordinary way. He used to take me fishing on Saturdays. He let me eat junk food in the car if we were driving somewhere far. He laughed easily. He trusted the world more, or maybe he just trusted himself inside it. After my mother left, something in him hardened. It wasn't immediate. It happened gradually, like a room getting colder, 1 degree at a time, until one day you realize you can't feel your hands anymore. He became strict first, then watchful, then controlling in a way that sounded like concern if you didn't listen too carefully. He installed a security system that pinged his phone every time a door opened. At the time, he said it was for our safety, because a house with only one adult and a young girl needed to be protected. That sounded reasonable, so I believed him. Then I noticed he always knew exactly when I came home, when I left, who had dropped me off, why I had been gone 14 extra minutes, why I hadn't answered a text 3 minutes after he sent it. He wanted the names of every friend, their parents' names too. He insisted on meeting people before I spent time with them. When school dances came around, he hovered so closely, it felt like I had shown up with a private investigator instead of a parent. At 11, that feels like embarrassment. At 16, you realize it's surveillance. I used to tell myself he was just scared, that the divorce had broken something in him, and I was the only thing left that made him feel anchored. I think part of that was true. The problem is that love mixed with fear can become possessive so quietly you don't even know it's happening until your entire life has narrowed around someone else's anxiety. I still saw my mother in California during summers, but those visits had their own sadness. She was rebuilding a life from scratch, working too much, dating men who kept getting younger, dressing like she was trying to outrun middle age and guilt at the same time. I didn't know where I fit in that new version of her world. I loved her, but every visit felt slightly off balance, like we were trying to perform a mother-daughter closeness that had been interrupted too long to come back naturally. She texted, she remembered birthdays, she tried in flashes, but there was always distance. I was a reminder of who she had been before she blew everything up, and I think that made it painful for both of us. So I learned early that both my parents loved me in complicated, unfinished ways. One left. One stayed too tightly. By the time I turned 18, college felt less like an academic goal and more like escape. I applied as far from Ohio as I possibly could without making it look theatrical. Seattle felt perfect. Physically far enough to breathe, emotionally far enough to become someone new. When I got into the University of Washington, I cried in my room with the acceptance email open on my laptop, not because I was sentimental about school, but because for the first time in years, I could imagine distance as something healing. My father acted supportive when I told him, but I saw the flash in his eyes before he covered it. Pride, yes, also panic. He helped me move into the dorm anyway, bought me practical things, acted like a father doing what fathers do. But even then, I could feel him trying to map the new perimeter of my life, trying to figure out how to keep hold of me from 2,000 miles away. The first year in Seattle felt like learning how to inhale properly after holding my breath too long. No one monitored when I came home. No one asked for a full report after coffee with a friend. No one tracked my every movement under the language of love. I made mistakes, stayed out too late sometimes, changed my mind about people, learned how to be lonely without panicking, learned how to build myself from the inside instead of around someone else's rules. I still called my father once a week because it felt easier than dealing with the consequences of not calling, but I learned quickly to keep the details of my life selective. Enough information to calm him down, not enough for him to micromanage me from Ohio. My mother and I texted on birthdays and holidays, sometimes more when one of us was trying a little harder than usual. We were polite, cautious, slowly circling each other without fully knowing how to reconnect. At the time, I thought my father was the bigger problem because he was more present in my life. I would later understand that absence leaves its own shape behind. Then, during my senior year, my roommate dragged me to a house party I had absolutely no interest in attending. That was the night I met Simon. He was standing in their kitchen trying to explain bridge engineering to a group of sorority girls who looked like they were praying for death or rescue, whichever came first. He had messy brown hair, glasses that kept slipping down his nose, and this dry, awkward sincerity that made him stand out immediately. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. That was the first thing I noticed. He was just genuinely being himself, and somehow that felt more magnetic than confidence ever could have. I rescued him from that conversation, mostly because I found the whole situation funny. We ended up talking for hours. Not flirting in some obvious, polished way, just talking. About cities, buildings, the strange intimacy of leaving home, the things we thought we would be by now and weren't. By the end of the night, I felt that rare, disorienting pull towards someone who seems to make time feel different. We exchanged numbers. I told myself not to make too much of it. Graduation was coming. Life was uncertain. He was older than me, already established, already working as an engineer for a local firm. I didn't want to start something serious right when everything in my own life was shifting. So for a while, we stayed in that in-between space. Coffee, movies, long conversations. Little by little, something solid started forming under it all. After graduation, I got a job at a marketing firm in Seattle and stayed in the city. That's when Simon and I stopped orbiting each other and actually became a couple. A year later, we moved in together, and that was the beginning of the real problem, though I didn't know it yet. Because the first time I brought Simon home to Ohio and introduced him to my father, I watched my dad smile politely, ask careful questions, nod at the right moments, and quietly begin building a case against the man I loved. I didn't understand it then. But looking back, I think that visit was the moment the future started coming for all of us. At first, I thought the visit had gone better than expected. Simon had been calm, respectful, even a little charming in that understated way he has when he's trying not to dominate a room. He answered my father's questions about work without sounding defensive, asked polite things about Ohio, complimented the food, and made an effort that I did not miss. I had been bracing for tension the entire drive there, so when dinner ended without raised voices or obvious confrontation, I let myself believe maybe I had worried for nothing. Then Simon mentioned casually that he had been married once before. It came up naturally. My father had asked about past relationships in that too curious tone he used whenever he was pretending to make conversation while really conducting an interview. Simon didn't flinch. He just told the truth. He had gotten married briefly in his early 20s. It had lasted 6 months. They had been young, incompatible, and wrong for each other. No scandal, no betrayal. Just a mistake made by two people who were old enough to sign papers and too young to understand what those papers meant. Simon said it simply, like an adult with nothing to hide. My father smiled and nodded. But I saw it, that subtle narrowing of his eyes, the way his fingers stilled on the edge of his glass, the tiny shift in his posture that would have meant nothing to anyone who didn't know him as well as I did. My father had heard one detail and locked onto it like a man finding the loose thread on a sweater, and deciding he would pull until the whole thing unraveled. On the drive back to Seattle, Simon asked, "Do you think he likes me?" I remember glancing at him and trying to sound lighter than I felt. "I think my dad doesn't really know how to like anyone who makes him feel replaceable." Simon looked at me for a moment after that, then back at the road. "That bad?" "I didn't say bad," I murmured. "I said complicated." That was the word I had spent most of my life using to excuse my father. Complicated. It made things sound nuanced instead of unhealthy. It gave me a vocabulary that didn't force me to call anything exactly what it was. After that visit, my father's calls became more frequent. Not aggressive at first. Casual. Measured. He would ask about work, then slide into questions about Simon. Was I sure we weren't moving too fast? Did I really know enough about him? Had he explained why his marriage failed? What exactly did engineer mean in terms of long-term stability? Did his family have good values? That last question made me laugh the first time because it sounded so old-fashioned, but my father wasn't joking. He was gathering material. I brushed it off. For years, I had become an expert at translating my father's behavior into something less alarming. He worries. He overthinks. He just wants me safe. Those explanations had been useful when I was 15. They sounded thinner at 24, but I still used them because the alternative meant admitting I had never really escaped his need to control the narrative of my life. Meanwhile, Simon and I kept building something real. That is the part that still hurts when I think back on it. We were happy in a way that felt unforced. We were not one of those couples performing perfection for social media or trying to convince other people we were right for each other. Life with Simon was quieter than that, better than that. He made coffee every morning, but somehow always forgot where he put his keys. He listened carefully when I talked about work, even the boring parts, and somehow remembered details I had forgotten mentioning. He never treated vulnerability like weakness. He made me feel considered. A year after I graduated, we moved in together. The apartment was nothing dramatic. Exposed brick, terrible natural light in the kitchen, a bathroom sink that clogged if you looked at it wrong, but it was ours. I remember unpacking dishes while Simon tried to assemble a bookshelf and swore under his breath because the instructions were somehow both too detailed and completely useless. We were tired, broke in the normal young adult way, and ridiculously happy. That happiness made my father more nervous than he ever admitted. He started calling with little warnings disguised as wisdom. "You're still young. Living together changes things. Don't let convenience trick you into commitment." He said it in the tone fathers use when they want to sound protective instead of intrusive. I would argue sometimes, but more often I would just let him talk until he ran out of momentum. What I didn't know then was that he was already building Simon into an idea instead of a person. A threat, a man with a past, a man who might take me fully out of reach. When Simon proposed, all of that fear turned into something sharper. It was our 3-year anniversary. He took me on a hike to a waterfall a couple of hours outside the city, one of those places that feels cinematic even when it's empty. It had rained earlier that morning, and everything looked washed clean. The rocks were dark with moisture, the air cold enough to wake every nerve in your body, the sound of the water so loud it made the rest of the world feel very far away. Simon was strange the entire hike. Too quiet, too careful. I thought maybe he was tired or nervous about something work-related. At one point, I even asked if he was okay, and he smiled in that distracted way people do when they're hiding an entire plan in their jacket pocket. When we reached the overlook, he just looked at me for a long second and said my name. That was it. No speech at first. Just Jessica. There are moments in life where your body understands what's happening half a second before your mind does. My heartbeat shifted. The air changed. He got down on one knee, hands visibly shaking, and pulled out a simple, elegant ring that somehow looked exactly like something I would choose for myself if I had been brave enough to say what I wanted out loud. He told me he loved the life we had built and the life he wanted next. He told me I made the world feel steadier. He said he wanted not just the exciting parts, but the ordinary ones. The tired mornings, the bad news, the grocery lists, the boring Tuesdays, all of it. I said yes before he even fully finished. I cried, which I hate doing in scenic locations because it makes me feel like I'm auditioning for a jewelry commercial, and then I laughed because he was crying too and pretending not to be. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking back down the trail in that floaty, half-dazed state that comes after a life changes shape right in front of you. For a few hours it was perfect. Then I called my father. He answered on the third ring. I can still remember exactly where I was standing, outside the trail parking lot, with damp leaves stuck to my shoes, the ring feeling new and almost unreal on my hand. "Dad," I said, smiling despite myself. Simon proposed. Silence. Not shock, not joy, not even confusion. Just silence so long that it curdled the entire moment. Then he exhaled slowly and said, "Jessica, I think you're making a mistake." It felt like being dropped from a height. He didn't ask if I was happy, didn't say congratulations, didn't ask how it happened or whether I was okay. He went straight into attack mode with the kind of cold certainty that told me he had been waiting for this exact call and already knew how he planned to respond. He brought up Simon's first marriage, questioned his judgment, questioned his maturity, questioned whether a man who had already failed once should be trusted with a second attempt. Then he moved on to money, which was almost laughable because Simon made decent money and I had never pretended to come from wealth. Still, my father hinted that some men liked stability more than love, and that I should think very carefully before tying myself legally to someone whose history suggested impulsiveness. I hung up before I started crying. Simon found me leaning against the car with my phone in my hand and one side of my body still lit up with happiness, while the other had already gone cold. "What happened?" he asked softly. I looked at him and forced out a smile that probably fooled no one. "My dad," I said, being exactly who he always is. That should have been the warning. Not that my father disapproved. That part wasn't surprising. It was the intensity of it, the speed, the absolute inability to let one moment belong to me without trying to drag his fear across it. Still, I kept moving. Wedding planning started, and for a little while I tried to keep my father on the edges of it. Small updates, minimal details, enough to avoid accusations of exclusion, not enough to invite control. It didn't work. He had opinions about everything. The venue was too expensive, even though Simon and I were paying for it ourselves. The guest list was too big, even though it was actually small compared to most weddings we knew. The honeymoon destination was unsafe. We were going to Canada. At one point, he called me to say that mountain venues were impractical because weather made people emotional and irrational. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Every decision became an opening for criticism. Every conversation carried this undertone of challenge, like he was waiting for me to wake up and realize he was the only sensible person in the room. He kept saying things like, "I just don't want you to rush into something you can't undo," which would have sounded loving if not for the fact that he said it with the intensity of a man trying to stop a train with his bare hands. Simon noticed the toll it was taking on me long before I admitted it. One night, after I got off a 40-minute call with my father about table arrangements that had somehow turned into a lecture about divorce statistics, Simon closed his laptop, looked at me from across the couch, and said, "Jess, he's not trying to help." "I know," I said too quickly. "You keep acting like this is normal." I hated him a little for being right. Not really hated, but the kind of resentment truth creates when it shows up before you're ready to welcome it. "I'm handling it," I muttered. Simon held my gaze. "No," he said quietly, "you're surviving it. That's different." I said nothing after that, because I didn't know how to explain the exhaustion of being raised by someone who loved you and frightened you in such confusing proportions. How do you tell the person you want to marry that your father has spent so many years making control sound like concern, that even now, at 28, some part of you still feels guilty for disappointing him? A week before the wedding, things escalated. My father showed up at our apartment unannounced. When I opened the door and saw him standing there with a thick manila folder tucked under his arm, something in my stomach dropped so hard it felt physical. He didn't look wild or unstable. That would have been easier, honestly. He looked composed, determined, the way people look when they believe they are about to perform a necessary intervention. "Jessica," he said, stepping inside before I had invited him in, "we need to have a serious conversation." Simon came out of the kitchen and stopped when he saw the folder. My father looked at both of us and said, "Sit down. This can't wait." I should have thrown him out right then. Instead, I sat. And that was how I ended up watching my father spread out the first pieces of the disaster that would destroy my wedding week. My father placed the thick manila folder on the coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence in a courtroom. He didn't rush. He moved slowly, carefully, almost ceremonially, as if the weight of what he was about to reveal justified the tension already building in the room. Simon sat beside me on the couch, calm but alert. I could feel the quiet strength in the way his hand rested on the cushion near mine, not touching yet, but close enough to remind me I wasn't facing this alone. My father opened the folder. Inside were dozens of papers, photographs, printouts, and notes clipped together with the kind of obsessive organization that made my stomach tighten before I even saw what they were. "This," he said, sliding a photograph across the table, "is the man you're about to marry." The photo showed Simon standing outside a bar, talking to two women. It was blurry, taken from a distance, the kind of image that could be interpreted 100 different ways depending on what story someone wanted it to tell. "They're his cousins," Simon said immediately after glancing at it. His voice remained steady. "That was at a family reunion last year." My father ignored him. He placed another photo down, then another. Different locations, different nights. Simon speaking with women, laughing, standing in groups. None of them showed anything inappropriate. But my father narrated each one like a detective unveiling a scandal. "You see the pattern," he said. "He tells you he's working late, but he's out drinking with other women." That's not what those photos show," I snapped. Simon leaned forward and calmly slid the pictures back across the table. "Patrick," he said, deliberately using my father's first name instead of Sir. "If you had asked me about any of these, I would have told you exactly where I was." My father's jaw tightened. But he continued. Next came printed screenshots from social media, old posts from Simon's college years, bad jokes, memes, comments taken out of context. My father tapped the pages with his finger. "This is the real character of the man you're trusting with your future." Simon read through them quietly. Then he looked up. "These are 10 years old." "That doesn't make them irrelevant." "It does make them immature jokes," Simon replied. I could feel anger rising in my chest, thick and hot. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what exactly do you think this proves?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the folder again and pulled out what looked like an official report. The paper had headings and formatting meant to resemble a professional background check. He slid it across the table toward me. "Because this," he said, "proves everything." I picked it up. Within seconds, I realized something was wrong. The formatting was inconsistent. Some sections were typed in different fonts. Dates didn't match the timeline of Simon's life. One part even referenced a company that didn't exist anymore. "Did you make this?" I asked quietly. My father didn't deny it. He simply looked at Simon. "You think you're clever," he said, "but you're not fooling me." Simon exhaled slowly. "I'm not fooling anyone because there's nothing to fool," he said. "Everything you've brought here can be explained." He began calmly addressing each accusation. The photos, the posts, the so-called report. For nearly 30 minutes, Simon patiently dismantled every claim. My father listened with a tight expression, but I could tell none of it mattered. The evidence wasn't the point. He had already decided what the story was. When Simon finished speaking, the room went quiet. Then my father said something that chilled me. "I'm not letting you ruin your life." The words hung in the air like a threat disguised as love. I stood up. "That's enough," I said. My voice shook, but I didn't stop. "You don't get to investigate the man I'm marrying like he's a criminal. You don't get to fabricate evidence, and you definitely don't get to decide my future." Simon remained seated, but I could feel his tension beside me. My father slowly gathered the papers back into the folder. "You'll thank me one day," he said. "Leave," I replied. For a moment I thought he might argue. Instead, he closed the folder, picked it up, and walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, he turned back. "I'm not finished," he said. The door closed behind him. Simon ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. Well," he said quietly. "That was intense." I sat down again, suddenly exhausted. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Simon shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong." But the truth was that something had shifted. Not just between my father and me, between Simon and the idea of becoming part of my family. We both felt it, and neither of us knew yet that the worst moment of this entire story hadn't happened yet. Because the next time my father called, he would say he had irrefutable proof, and that proof would destroy everything we thought was about to happen. The next afternoon, my phone rang while I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to focus on a seating chart for the wedding reception. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering because the name flashing across it already told me the conversation wasn't going to be simple. My father. His voice sounded unusually calm when I picked up. "Jessica, I need to see you and Simon again," he said. "There's something important you need to hear." I felt my shoulders tense immediately. We already talked yesterday," I replied. "I'm not doing another interrogation." "This isn't an interrogation," he said quickly. "It's proof." The word hung in the air. Proof. I closed my eyes for a second. "Dad." "I'm serious," he interrupted. "Meet me tomorrow morning at the cafe near the venue. I'll bring someone who can explain everything." "Explain what?" "That Simon isn't who you think he is." I almost hung up right there. But something in his voice, something quiet and certain, made me hesitate. Part of me still believed that if I just let him finish whatever twisted investigation he thought he was conducting, we could put this behind us and move forward with the wedding. That was my mistake. The cafe was crowded when Simon and I arrived the next morning. It was one of those modern places with big windows and the smell of espresso drifting through the air. Normally, it would have been a relaxing spot to sit and talk. That day, it felt like walking into a courtroom. My father was already there. He was sitting at a corner table with a young woman I had never seen before. She looked to be around my age, maybe a little younger. Dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail, nervous hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. My father stood up when we approached. "Jessica," he said. Simon and I sat down across from them. "This is Jennifer," my father continued. The woman nodded awkwardly. "Hi." I waited. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then Jennifer inhaled slowly and began talking. Her voice sounded rehearsed. She said she had been seeing Simon for over a year, that their relationship had started casually but had grown serious, that he had promised her he would eventually leave me once he figured out how to end things without causing a scene. My brain refused to process the words at first. I turned toward Simon. He looked completely stunned. "I have never seen this woman before in my life," he said immediately. Jennifer kept going, describing supposed secret meetings, late-night visits, promises Simon had made to her. The details sounded specific. Too specific. But the more she talked, the stranger Simon's expression became. Not defensive. Confused. "Jessica," he said quietly, "I swear to you." My father leaned forward. "You see," he said sharply, "this is exactly what I was trying to show you." The cafe around us had grown quieter. People were starting to notice the tension at our table. Simon looked directly at Jennifer. "What's your last name?" he asked. She hesitated. For just a second, then she answered. But the hesitation was enough. Simon turned to me. "She's lying." Jennifer's composure cracked. At first it was subtle. Her eyes flicked toward my father. Her fingers tightened around the cup in front of her. Then she suddenly stood up. "I can't do this," she said. Her voice trembled. "I'm sorry." The words rushed out like they had been trapped behind her teeth. He paid me," she blurted. The entire cafe seemed to freeze. My father's face drained of color. Jennifer looked at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm an actress," she said. "Or I try to be. I'm behind on rent, and he offered me $2,000 to come here and say all that." She gestured weakly toward my father. "He gave me a script." No one spoke. The air felt thick and unreal. Jennifer grabbed her bag and rushed toward the door. Within seconds, she was gone. The silence that followed was almost worse than the lie. Simon stood up. His hands were shaking. "You paid someone to accuse me of cheating," he said slowly. My father didn't answer. For the first time since I could remember, he looked uncertain. Simon turned toward me. "I can't do this," he said quietly. The words felt like the physical blow. "I can't marry into a family where someone will go this far." I felt my chest tighten. Simon. "I love you," he said quickly. "But this is insane." My father tried to speak then. "Jessica, I was trying to protect—" "Stop," I said. The word came out louder than I expected. Every eye in the cafe was on us now. "You lied," I continued. "You humiliated us. You tried to destroy my relationship." My father opened his mouth again. But I didn't wait for the explanation. I stood up and grabbed my coat. Simon followed me outside. The cold air hit my face as we stepped onto the sidewalk. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Simon said the sentence I had been terrified of hearing. "We can't have the wedding next week." The world felt like it tilted. All the months of planning, the guests, the venue, everything. "I know," I whispered. That afternoon we started making the calls. Family, friends, vendors. Each conversation felt like reliving the humiliation all over again. "Family emergency," we told people. That was the simplest explanation. The truth was too complicated. By the time the sun went down, our wedding had officially been postponed, and I was left sitting on the couch beside the man I loved, wondering whether my father had just destroyed the most important relationship of my life. The morning after the cafe disaster felt unreal. I woke up before Simon, even though neither of us had slept much. The apartment was quiet in that uncomfortable way that happens after a major argument or shock, when the walls themselves seem to remember what happened the night before. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. Messages were already coming in. Friends asking if everything was okay. Vendors requesting confirmation about the sudden cancellation. A few confused relatives who had heard that the rehearsal dinner had been called off. I didn't answer any of them yet. Instead, I waited for Simon to wake up. When he finally walked into the kitchen, he looked exhausted. His hair was messy, his eyes red from lack of sleep. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the table. Then he sat down. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I nodded. The conversation lasted most of the morning. Simon didn't yell. That somehow made it harder. He spoke calmly, carefully choosing his words, but there was a raw honesty in everything he said. "What your dad did yesterday," he began, "wasn't just a misunderstanding. I know. He tried to destroy my reputation in front of you. I know. And the worst part," Simon continued gently, "is that this didn't come out of nowhere." I looked down at my coffee. He wasn't wrong. "For years," he said, "you've told me stories about your dad crossing boundaries. And every time it happened, you said it wasn't that bad. You said he meant well." I swallowed hard. I guess I kept hoping he would change. Simon leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "I love you, Jess. That hasn't changed. But yesterday made me realize something. If we get married, your dad becomes part of my life too." The words hung between us. And I don't know if I can live with someone who will go to those lengths to sabotage us. It hurt to hear, but I understood. We sat there for a long time without speaking. Finally, I said, "So what do we do?" Simon looked at me carefully. We slowed down. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the one we needed. We agreed to postpone the wedding indefinitely, not cancel. Just pause. Give ourselves time to process everything. Later that day, Simon suggested something I hadn't expected. "Couples counseling," he said. I hesitated at first. Therapy always sounded like something people did when relationships were falling apart, not when they were trying to save them. But the more we talked about it, the more it made sense. Within a week, we found a therapist who specialized in family trauma and relationship conflict. Our first session was uncomfortable. The second one was harder. But by the third session, something began to shift. Simon and I started understanding each other's fears more clearly. He admitted that what scared him most wasn't my father's behavior itself. It was the idea that my father might always be able to manipulate his way back into our lives. And I had to face something even more uncomfortable. For years I had been making excuses for my father, not because I agreed with him, but because I didn't know how to stop loving someone who had been both my protector and my biggest source of anxiety. A few days later, I decided to confront him. I called and asked if we could meet somewhere neutral. Not at our apartment, not at his house. A public park near downtown. When I arrived, he was already sitting on a bench. For the first time in a long while, he looked smaller, older. His shoulders were slumped, and his hair seemed grayer than I remembered. For a moment, I almost felt guilty. Then I remembered the cafe, the actress, the humiliation. I sat down across from him. "Why?" I asked. The single word seemed to break something inside him. He looked down at his hands. "I thought I was protecting you." "From what?" "From making the same mistake your mother made." The bitterness in his voice was still there, but now it sounded exhausted instead of angry. He told me things I had never heard before. After the divorce, he had fallen into a deep depression. He had convinced himself that if he lost me too, he would have nothing left. Over the years, that fear had turned into something obsessive. He admitted he had been seeing a doctor recently. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. It was a letter from a psychiatrist confirming he had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder. The diagnosis didn't excuse what he had done, but it explained some of it. "I became convinced Simon was going to hurt you," he said quietly. "I started looking for proof everywhere." "And when you couldn't find any," I replied, "you invented it." He closed his eyes. "Yes." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said something that had taken me years to learn. "I can understand your fear without accepting your behavior." He nodded slowly. "I know. If you want any chance of being part of my life again," I continued, "you need help. Real help." "I've started therapy," he said quickly. "I'll keep going. And you need to apologize to Simon." His expression tightened. But after a long pause, he nodded. "I will." I left the park that day, feeling emotionally drained, but strangely lighter. For the first time, my father had admitted he was wrong. It wasn't a complete fix, but it was the beginning of something different. Back at home, Simon was waiting for me. "How did it go?" he asked. I sat down beside him. "It was complicated." He smiled slightly. "That seems to be a theme." But for the first time since the wedding collapsed, we both felt a small flicker of hope that maybe the story wasn't over yet. 2 months passed after that conversation in the park, and the chaos that had swallowed our lives began to settle into something quieter, something slower. Simon and I kept going to counseling every week. At first it felt awkward, like we were dissecting something fragile under a microscope. But over time, the sessions became less about the disaster that had happened, and more about understanding the patterns that led us there. Our therapist was calm and patient, the kind of person who listened longer than she spoke. She helped us see how easily family history can shape the way you react to conflict without you realizing it. One of the hardest things Simon said during those sessions was also the most honest. "Yeah, you didn't just grow up with a controlling father," he told me one evening after therapy. "You grew up learning how to manage him." He wasn't accusing me. He was explaining something I had never fully put into words myself. For most of my life, I had been navigating around my father's fears instead of confronting them. I adjusted my behavior so he wouldn't panic. I softened the truth so he wouldn't overreact. I kept the peace, even when it meant sacrificing my own comfort. And without realizing it, I had carried that habit into my adult life. Our weekend trip came at exactly the right time. We drove 3 hours to a quiet beach town neither of us had visited before. The air smelled like salt and seaweed, and the little hotel we stayed in had a balcony that overlooked the ocean. The first evening was strange. Neither of us quite knew how to relax after months of tension. We walked along the beach, mostly in silence, listening to the waves crash against the shore. Eventually, Simon stopped walking and looked at me. "Jess," he said, "do you still want this?" I knew what he meant. "More than anything," I answered. "But it has to be different," he said. "No more pretending your dad's behavior is normal." I nodded. "No more excuses." The next morning, we sat on the balcony drinking coffee and talking about our future in a way that felt honest for the first time in weeks. Simon admitted he had always wanted children someday, but the situation with my father had made him question whether bringing kids into that kind of family dynamic would be fair. I confessed something I had never said out loud before. I'm scared of becoming like him. Simon reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You won't," he said quietly, "because you're willing to face your mistakes." Those conversations changed something between us. By the time we drove back to Seattle, we had made a decision. We were still getting married, just not the way we originally planned. The big venue, the elaborate reception, the long guest list, all of it suddenly felt unnecessary. Instead, we started planning a small ceremony with only the people who had actually supported us through everything. 30 guests, a small garden venue, no pressure, no drama, just the people who mattered. Meanwhile, my father continued therapy. True to his word, he sent me weekly updates. They weren't long messages, just brief notes about the sessions he attended and what he was learning. Sometimes he mentioned how difficult it was confronting his own behavior. Sometimes he simply wrote that he was still trying. A few weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to Simon. My father had written it by hand. It wasn't perfect. Some parts still sounded defensive, but overall it was sincere. He admitted that his fear of losing me had driven him to extreme behavior. He acknowledged that paying Jennifer to lie had been wrong. He apologized not only for the humiliation, but also for the stress he had caused in our relationship. Simon read the letter twice. "What do you think?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "It's a start." Around the same time, my mom extended her stay in Seattle. She had originally planned to leave after the canceled wedding, but she decided to remain longer to help us sort through the practical mess that had followed. She made calls to vendors, negotiated refunds where she could, and helped us organize all the decorations we had already purchased. But the most important thing she gave me wasn't logistical help. It was honesty. For the first time, we talked openly about her marriage to my father. She described years of controlling behavior that I had only seen pieces of as a child. She admitted that her affair had been a terrible mistake, but she also explained how suffocated she had felt long before that. Hearing those stories didn't excuse what either of them had done, but it helped me understand the complexity of the family I came from. One afternoon, Jennifer, the actress from the cafe, reached out again. She sent me copies of the text messages my father had sent her when he hired her. The conversation laid out the plan in painful detail. What she was supposed to say, how much he would pay, when she should appear emotional. Reading those messages felt strange. Not because they shocked me anymore, but because they reminded me how desperate my father had been to stop the wedding. I saved the files, not because I intended to use them, but because some part of me wanted proof that the whole nightmare had actually happened. As the weeks passed, Simon and I slowly returned to normal life. Work helped. I threw myself into a large marketing campaign for a new client at the firm, which gave me something productive to focus on. Simon supported me through every late night and stressful presentation, often bringing takeout home when I was too exhausted to cook. We started talking about the future again, not just the wedding. Everything after. Buying a house someday, traveling, maybe building a family of our own. The idea of the wedding no longer felt like a fragile dream waiting to collapse. It felt like a decision we were making together. But before that could happen, there was still one thing left to face. Simon and I had agreed to meet my father again, this time with our therapist present, and the outcome of that conversation would determine whether he had any place in our lives moving forward. 6 months after the cafe incident, my life looked completely different from the chaos I had written about in my first post. The meeting with my father happened exactly as we had planned, in the quiet office of our couples therapist. I remember sitting there with Simon beside me, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and determination. I didn't know what version of my father would walk through that door. The man who had tried to sabotage my wedding, or the man who had been slowly working through therapy and trying to change. When he arrived, the difference was noticeable immediately. He looked calmer, older somehow, but calmer. The frantic intensity that used to sit behind his eyes had softened. For the first time in years, he didn't try to dominate the conversation when he sat down. Instead, he listened. Our therapist guided the discussion carefully, making sure everyone had space to speak. Simon explained how the cafe incident had shaken his trust, not just in my father, but in the idea of becoming part of my family. I talked about the years of control, the constant anxiety of trying to manage my father's reactions, and how painful it had been to watch the happiest moment of my life turn into humiliation. My father didn't interrupt. When it was finally his turn to speak, he took a long breath before saying anything. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but hearing them felt strangely heavy. My father had never been good at admitting fault. For years, he had always found a way to justify his actions, to frame them as necessary or misunderstood. This time he didn't. He explained that therapy had forced him to confront how his fear had warped his thinking. After my mom left, he became convinced that the people he loved would always abandon him eventually. When Simon entered my life, that fear turned into obsession. "I told myself I was protecting you," he said quietly. "But the truth is, I was protecting my own fear." He turned toward Simon then. "I'm sorry for what I did to you. You didn't deserve any of it." Simon nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that," he replied, "but trust takes time to rebuild." "I know," my father said. For the next hour, we talked openly about boundaries. Our therapist made it clear that if my father wanted any relationship with us moving forward, those boundaries had to be respected completely. No interference in our marriage. No attempts to control decisions. No manipulation disguised as concern. My father agreed. Whether he would truly keep those promises was something only time would reveal. A few weeks later, Simon and I made the decision that surprised almost everyone around us. We invited my father to the wedding. It wasn't an easy choice. There were long conversations between Simon and me about whether it was worth the risk. In the end, what convinced us wasn't the past, but the possibility of the future. If my father was truly trying to change, shutting him out forever might prevent any healing from happening. So we sent the invitation. 3 months later, on a warm Saturday afternoon, Simon and I stood together in a small garden surrounded by 30 people who had supported us through the entire ordeal. There were no extravagant decorations, no giant reception hall. Just flowers, sunlight, and the quiet excitement of people who genuinely cared about us. I walked down the aisle with my mom. That moment alone meant more to me than I expected. For years, our relationship had been distant and awkward, but over the past months, we had rebuilt something real between us. Having her beside me that day felt like closing a chapter that had started when I was 10 years old. Simon was waiting at the front of the garden, smiling in that calm way he always does when he's nervous. When we reached him, he squeezed my hands gently. "You ready?" he whispered. "More than ready," I said. We wrote our own vows. Mine talked about choosing partnership every day, even when life becomes messy and complicated. Simon promised to keep building a life where honesty mattered more than pride and where both of us could grow without fear. By the time we finished, almost everyone in the garden was crying, even my father. During the reception, he stood up unexpectedly to give a short speech. The room grew quiet as he walked toward the microphone. For a second, I worried he might say something dramatic or uncomfortable. Instead, he looked directly at Simon and me. "I made some serious mistakes this year," he said, "and I'm grateful that my daughter and her husband gave me the chance to try to do better." He paused. "I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that their trust wasn't wasted." The applause that followed wasn't loud or exaggerated. It was warm, honest. Simon squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "That's probably the most surprising plot twist of this entire year." We both laughed. Now, several months later, married life feels calmer than anything I imagined during the chaos of last year. Simon and I are settling into routines that feel comfortable and steady. We're planning a honeymoon trip to New Zealand next summer and starting to look at houses in a nearby neighborhood where we might eventually put down roots. My relationship with my dad is still cautious. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, but he continues therapy and respects the boundaries we've set. For now, that's enough. This entire experience forced me to learn something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. Family isn't defined solely by blood. It's defined by respect, by accountability, by the willingness to grow when you've made mistakes. I started this journey feeling like my life had been destroyed by the person who was supposed to protect me. 6 months later, I'm standing in a completely different place. Married to someone who stood beside me through the worst moment of our relationship. Surrounded by people who support us. And finally confident enough to set boundaries that protect the life we're building together. Sometimes the most painful chapters in our lives become the ones that teach us how to write the next chapter better.